Chapter 15 of The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution by William Cooper Nell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by the Progressing America Project. The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Chapter 15. Kentucky. Henry Boyd, Lewis Hayden, the heroic and generous Kentucky slave. Henry Boyd was born a slave in Kentucky. Footnote. This account is taken from the lips of a friend who resided in Cincinnati and had good opportunity to know the facts. Of imposing stature, well-knit muscles, and the countenance of one of nature's noblemen, at the age of 18, he had so far won the confidence of his master that he not only consented to sell him the right and title to his freedom, but gave him his own time to earn the money. With a general pass from his master, Henry made his way to the Kanawha Salt Works, celebrated as the place where Senator Ewing, of Ohio, chopped out his education with his axe. And there, too, with his axe, did Henry Boyd chop out his liberty. By performing double labor, he got double wages. In the daytime, he swung his axe upon the wood, and for half the night he tended the boiling salt kettles, sleeping the other half by their side. After having accumulated a sufficient sum, he returned to his master and paid it over for his freedom. He next applied himself to learn the trade of a carpenter and joiner. Such was his readiness to acquire the use of tools, that he soon qualified himself to receive the wages of a journeyman. In Kentucky, prejudice does not forbid master mechanics to teach colored men their trades. He now resolved to quit the dominions of slavery and try his fortunes in a free state, and accordingly directed his steps to the city of Cincinnati. The journey reduced his purse to the last quarter of a dollar, but, with his tools on his back, and a set of muscles that well knew how to use them, he entered the city with a light heart. Little did he dream of the reception he was to meet. There was work enough to be done in his line, but no master workman would employ, quote, a nigger, end quote. Day after day did Henry Boyd offer his services from shop to shop, but as often he was repelled, generally with insult, and once with a kick. At last, he found the shop of an Englishman, too recently arrived to understand the grand peculiarity of American feeling. This man put a plane into his hand, and asked him to make proof of his skill. "This is in bad order," said Boyd, and with that he gave the instrument certain nice professional knocks with the hammer, till he brought it to suit his practiced eye. "Enough," said the Englishman, "I see you can use tools." Boyd, however, proceeded to dress a board in a very able and workmanlike manner, while the journeymen from a long line of benches gathered round, with looks that bespoke a deep personal interest in the matter. "You may go to work," said the master of the shop, right glad to employ so good a workman. The words had no sooner left his mouth than his American journeymen, unbuttoning their aprons, called, as one man, for the settlement of their wages. What? Said the Englishman. "What does this mean?" Quote, "It means that we will not work with a nigger," end quote, replied the journeyman. "But he is a first-rate workman." Quote, "But we won't stay in the same shop with a nigger. We are not in the habit of working with niggers." End quote. "Then I will build a shanty outside, and he shall work in that." Quote, No, we won't work for a boss who employs niggers. Pay us up, and we'll be off." End quote. The poor master of the shop turned, with a despairing look, to Boyd. Quote, "You see how it is, my friend. My workmen will all leave me. I am sorry for it, but I can't hire you." End quote. Even at this repulse, our adventurer did not despair. There might still be mechanics, in the outskirts of the city, who had too few journeymen to be bound by their prejudices. His quarter of a dollar had long since disappeared, but, by carrying a traveler's trunk, or turning his hand to any chance job, he contrived to exist till he had made application to every carpenter and joiner in the city and its suburbs. No one would employ him. By this time, the iron of prejudice, more galling than anything he had ever known of slavery, had entered his soul. He walked down on the river's bank below the city, and, throwing himself upon the ground, gave way to an agony of despair. He had found himself the object of universal contempt. His plans were all frustrated, his hopes dashed, and his dear-bought freedom made of no effect. By such trials, weak minds are prostrated in abject and slavish servility. Strong ones are made the enemies and depredators of society, and it is only the highest class of moral heroes that come off like gold from the furnace. Of this class, however, was Henry Boyd. Recovering from his dejection, he surveyed the brawny muscles that strung his Herculean limbs. A new design rushed into his mind, a new resolution filled his heart. He sprang upon his feet, and walked firmly and rapidly towards the city, doubtless with aspirations that might have fitted the words of the poet, quote, "Thy spirit, independence, let me share, Lord of the lion heart and eagle eye." End quote. The first object which attracted his eagle eye, on reaching the city, was one of the huge river boats, laden with pig iron, drawing up to the landing. The captain of this craft was just inquiring of the merchant who owned its contents, for a hand to assist in unloading it. "I am the very fellow for you," said Boyd, stripping off his coat, rolling up his sleeves, and laying hold of the work. "Yes, sure enough, that is the very fellow for you," said the merchant. The resolution and alacrity of Boyd interested him exceedingly, and during the 4 or 5 days, whilst a flotilla of boats were discharging their cargoes of pig iron with unaccustomed dispatch, he became familiar with his history, with the exception of all that pertained to his trade, which Boyd thought proper to keep to himself. In consequence, our adventurer next found himself promoted to the portership of the merchant's store, a post which he filled to great satisfaction. He had a hand and a head for everything, and an occasion was not long wanting to prove it. A joiner was engaged to erect a counter, but failing by a drunken frolic, the merchant was disappointed and vexed. Rather in passion than in earnest, he turned to his faithful porter. "Here, Henry, you can do almost anything. Why can't you do this job?" "Perhaps I could, sir, if I had my tools and the stuff," was the reply. "Your tools!" exclaimed the merchant in surprise, for till now he knew nothing of his trade. Boyd explained that he had learned the trade of a carpenter and joiner, and had no objection to try the job. The merchant handed him the money, and told him to make as good a counter as he could. The work was done with such promptitude, judgment, and finish, that his employer broke off a contract for the erection of a large frame warehouse, which he was about closing with the same mechanic, who had disappointed him in the matter of the counter, and gave the job to Henry. The money was furnished, and Boyd was left to procure the materials and boss the job at his own discretion. This he found no difficulty in doing, and what is remarkable, among the numerous journeymen whom he employed, were some of the very men who took off their aprons at his appearance in the Englishman's shop. The merchant was so pleased with his new warehouse that he proceeded to set up the intelligent builder in the exercise of his trade in the city. Thus Henry Boyd found himself raised at once, almost beyond the reach of the prejudice which had well nigh crushed him. He built houses and accumulated property. White journeymen and apprentices were glad to be in his employment, and to sit at his table. He is now a wealthy mechanic, living in his own house in Cincinnati, and his enemies who have tried to supplant him have as good reason as his friends to know that he is a man of sound judgment and of most vigorous intellect. Lewis Hayden, once a slave in Kentucky, but now a free man in Boston, Massachusetts, in his extensive business and social relations, commands the respect of an increasing circle in the community. William H. Channing, in a sketch entitled "A Day in Kentucky," says, quote, "I wish to relate what was told to me by one of the daughters of Judge K. as we walked over the estate. It all looks bright and peaceful and happy, does it not?" said she, as, standing on a little knoll under a group of hickory trees, she pointed over the wide fields to the family mansion and the cluster of slave huts, at whose doors the children, in swarms, were playing, with the noisy glee of the African. "But," she continued, after a gloomy pause, "to us, who know what slavery is, This peace is the green corruption of a stagnant pool, the peace of death. Oh, worse, far worse, it is the yawning grave of humanity. Do you see that spreading beach yonder, just on the edge of the hemp field, where the ditch runs? It was there that my brother Frank received the blow on the forehead, of which you observed, perhaps, the scar. I will tell you about it. It was his duty, at that time, to keep the nightly watch, for, you know, she said, turning to me with a smile of bitter irony, that we have to be guardians to these poor friends, who love us so as never to leave us. Well, Frank kept the nightly watch. Armed to the teeth, with a dark lantern, he passed once or twice, or oftener, round the plantation. One stormy night, some 2 years since, he had reached that spot, when suddenly he heard a crackling sound through the hemp stalks. He cloaked his lantern, drew a pistol, and stepped behind the tree. In a moment, a man, with stealthy tread, approached the ditch, which is the boundary of the farm on that side. Frank flashed the light upon him. It was his own favorite slave, Ned, of the same age with himself, almost a foster brother, for his mother was Frank's nurse, his fellow rambler in the woods, his playfellow through early years. Hunting, fishing, swimming, nutting, taming horses, every sport had been shared by them. Frank loved that man, and Ned, I believe in my heart, loved him. He was high-spirited and manly, though a Negro, strong, bold, and somewhat passionate, and, as we found out afterwards, he had been struck that day by the overseer. It was a dreadful meeting. "Ned," said my brother, "turn back. I cannot in honor let you go. I am my father's watchman. You pass that ditch only over my body. Come, turn back. You know I am your friend. We are all your friends." "Master Frank," answered the noble fellow, for he was so, though he almost killed my brother. "Master Frank, God knows I would die for you, but, I forewarn you, I will not be taken. That wretch shall never lay his hand on me again. Let me pass, I beseech you, let me pass." Frank stood firm. Again, Ned besought him in vain. He then turned to leap aside. Frank cried, "Beware, I shall fire," and, quick as he thought, Ned struck him a stunning blow. He fell, utterly insensible. And what did that man do? Did he leap the ditch and fly? No, he took my bleeding brother on his shoulders, he carried him to the nearest slave hut, roused the inmates, set him erect by the door, and then, and not till then, made his escape. Time enough elapsed before Frank could come to himself, and be carried to the house, and my father waked, for Ned to get clear off. The darkness, too, and the storm favored him. He was gone, and I do believe we were all glad. Frank never blamed him. How could he? In the same case, would he not have done the same? Well, 2 months passed away, when, early one morning, the overseer found Ned asleep under some bushes, and brought him to the house. I will tell you where he had been afterwards, but see the cunning of the creature, a cunning and deceit we all sow in all slaves, and therefore ought to reap. He knelt to my father and said, "Pardon, master, pardon. I have tried free bread, and it is not good. No friends for the poor slave among the mean white folks over the river, and so I have come back to you, master." My father did not have him punished, but ordered him to be bound with ropes and left in an empty room. The day passed, 2 or 3 days, indeed, and Ned was still bound. Meanwhile, the overseer threatened him with being sent down the river. You know what that means, don't you? It means sent to sweat and starve, and die by inches, in the sugar fields of Louisiana. Ned caught the alarm. By connivance of someone, he got a knife, and, when all was still, cut his ropes, and cautiously made his way out of the house. It was a stormy night, his tracks were plain, but he could not help it. He ran to the neighboring plantation yonder, where his wife lived, and gave his peculiar whistle under her window. She was awake and heard him. Poor soul, I dare say she had hardly slept, from anxiety, for the 2 months after he ran away. She raised the window. "Jump down," whispered Ned. "Jump down, just as you are. Wait not a second." She jumped, and, catching her in his arms, they escaped together. Next morning, pursuit was made from both plantations. Not that my father wished Ned to be taken, but our neighbor was not willing to lose the woman, who was a house servant and very valuable. The pursuers, however, were deceived by the tracks, which were half buried up, and chilled and blinded by the storm, which was uncommonly severe for this part of the world, and at night gave up the hunt. We heard no more of them till last summer, when traveling through Canada. Whom should we find as servant at a hotel in Prescott but this rascal Ned? At first, he was shy and grave, and affected perfect ignorance. But it was always a saying of my father's, quote, "If a nigger has sense enough to run off, and get safely out of the States, he must be a smart fellow, and has sense enough, too, to take care of himself, and he shall be free and welcome." End quote. And Ned soon saw that we were his friends, and told us his adventures. It seems that when he first escaped, he made his way good to Canada, but no sooner did he feel himself safe, than the thought of his wife in slavery so overcame him, that he instantly resolved to return, at all risks, and free her too. Night and day he traveled back, till he reached our plantation, when, utterly overcome with fatigue and hunger, he fell asleep and was taken. Then, as I have told you, he played possum, as the negroes say, till he caught the hint of being sent away, when he escaped again. And now see how a kind Providence aided those poor creatures. Would you believe it? The men who pursued them came to the very barn, into which they had crept for concealment when the day broke. They trod, over and over again, upon their bodies, which were covered by the heaps of straw and hay. They cursed and swore, and consulted together, and vowed to take them, at the very ears of their victims, and yet they were kept safe. As soon as it was night, they set off again, through the snow, and hid themselves a second day in the wood, half frozen and famished. The third night they reached the Ohio, by good fortune found a boat, paddled themselves over, and were safe. Friends forwarded them to Canada, and, when we saw them, they were as happy as people could be, with every prospect of success. "And now," said the beautiful girl, drawing herself up to her full height and folding her arms, "I know not what you may think, for some of you Northerners seem to me, with all deference, to have the spirit of slaves yourselves. But, Kentuckian as I am, and on this slave soil, I dare to say it, Ned is a hero whom, if he had lived in the good old days of Greece, would have had his deeds immortalized in the strains of some Homer." The conversation of this spirited woman gave rise to some thoughts, which I will briefly state, for the benefit of those dull folks, who are too lazy to crack a nut and pick out the kernel. First, all slaveholders are not insensible to the great outrages daily committed by slavery upon justice and affection, nor indifferent to the welfare of those whom they know to be brethren. There are pure-hearted men and women at the South, deserving our respect, our sympathy, counsel, aid, and prayers. Second, if a Northern man relishes contempt and insult, he can find it, in any quantity and intensity, by professing to be an admirer of their peculiar domestic institutions at the South. Southerners rarely believe such professions, and are apt to think him who makes them a hypocrite, or, if they suppose him sincere, to despise him for a mean-spirited, stupid booby. Third, if, even under slavery, the African race exhibits such heroic and lovely traits, would they not be noble men, if bound to their white fellow-freemen by the triple bond of gratitude and mutual confidence and generous emulation? End of chapter 15.